All right, welcome back to Apologetics. We're moving on in our outline for the class, and tonight we're actually going to finish the second section. So we started out with the class making good arguments that there is a God, and now we spent the last several weeks talking about whether or not Jesus is God, looking at good reasons and evidence to believe that Jesus is that supreme being. So we're going to wrap that up with lecture 11 tonight, and this is zooming into that section, that Jesus is God. And what we're going to do tonight is cover several reasons to believe that Jesus is God. We've been focusing on the main one, which is his miracles, but tonight what I've titled this lecture, A Cumulative Case that Jesus is God, because there's more reasons to believe that Jesus was God than just his miracles, although I think that's probably the strongest reason. So oftentimes when I get an opportunity to give a lecture or speak at a church on this issue, this is the type of format that I go through. Instead of 3 or 4 lectures making a case for his miracles, I just focus everything on this one cumulative case and go through all the reasons to believe that Jesus is God. And the way I like to start it out is kind of like a situation where, somebody on the street comes up to me. Let's say I'm walking down the street, going to a restaurant or something, and somebody rushes up to me on the street and says, my friend Joshua is God, and tries to convince me or tell me or make the claim to me that his friend Joshua is God in the flesh. Now, most likely, if somebody came up to me on the street and did that, I wouldn't believe them. And you probably wouldn't either, right? I wouldn't be completely opposed to the idea, right? I wouldn't say it's impossible, because as a theist, I do believe that there's a God out there, and if he wanted to take on human nature, he certainly could do that if he wanted to, being an all-powerful being. But if somebody coming up on the street telling me that, I probably wouldn't believe them. I'd be open to the idea, but unless they gave me some additional reasons to believe their friend Joshua was really God, I probably would not believe their claim. However, let's go through this hypothetical situation with this person on the street, and let's say he does start giving me good reasons to believe his friend Joshua is in fact God. And I use the name Joshua because that's the Hebrew root of the name Yeshua, which we say in English Jesus, right? So really I'm taking that analogy to the case where we're claiming that Jesus is God. But let's say, for example, the guy on the street tells me that there are 2 billion people that believe his friend is God. Now that doesn't prove, right, that his friend is God, and I'm going to start using the name Jesus here because that's what we're talking about. I just use that as kind of a setup to the whole lecture. 2 billion people could be wrong, obviously, right? But if 2 billion people believe something, well, at least now you've got my attention, right? So the person on the street, if they provide good evidence that there's 2 billion people who believe that Jesus is God, well, now I'm more open to consider the reasons that have led these 2 billion people to that conclusion, right? Now they've got my attention. Well, let's say then also this person on the street says that his friend is the one of the greatest, if not the greatest, moral teachers of all time. And this is the case with Jesus. Even non-Christians agree that his moral teaching is exemplary. It's quite remarkable looking throughout history and everybody who's taught good moral things. Jesus is right there at the top. In fact, some of his morality or some of his moral teaching has flipped entire cultures upside down, teaching us these, what seemed like crazy things at first, like loving our enemies. I mean, that just does not come natural to us. But much of the world has embraced this idea that no, in fact, Jesus was right. We should love our enemies. And so he's heralded, even by non-Christians, as one of the, if not the greatest, moral teachers of all time. So, okay, you're building a good case. 2 billion people believe. Here's one of the reasons they believe that. Another reason, let's say this person on the street gives me, is that this person actually lived out the moral standard that he taught. Most moral teachers don't do that. Most moral teachers, including myself, I try to tell people what is the right thing, right? Don't lie, don't be greedy, don't be prideful. But I also admit, as I teach those things, that I fail in all of those areas. I do tell lies. I know that's not right, but I make mistakes. I am greedy. I am too prideful. So most moral teachers throughout history have admitted the moral standards that they agree are correct, they fail to live up to. But as based on the best historical information that we have, Jesus was able to live out this very high moral standard that he taught people to live by, which is pretty remarkable. Even his enemies, if the New Testament's historically reliable, then even his enemies couldn't find anything to accuse him of. And they had to accuse him of trumped up charges because they couldn't find anything wrong with him, any skeletons in the closet to dig out, so to speak. So having your enemies say that of you is pretty impressive. Reason number 4, and these first few we're just going through really quickly. We're going to look in total tonight at 7 reasons to believe that Jesus is God. And the first 3 we're just going through pretty quickly. But the next one, number 4, is that Jesus is one of the, if not the most influential persons in all of history. Now, this really isn't debatable. His influence has been absolutely remarkable on the culture of the world, right? I mean, cultures around the world have been influenced tremendously by this individual. And if you think about it, how he was able to, just from a human perspective now, right? If we're trying to evaluate if this person was really God or not, just from a human perspective, if you look at what he did, I mean, he was a poor, itinerant teacher for 3 years in some rinky-dink part of the world, not a major part of the world at that time, nor really this time either, right? In Israel. Just so kind of out in a rural environment, he wandered around and taught for 3 years. And to do that, to have the sort of the worldwide influence for 2,000 years now, from just a short, really 3-year ministry of wandering around teaching a few people for 3 years, is quite remarkable. In fact, there's something I want to read for you. You might have heard it before. It was written, I believe, in the early 1900s, but then it was used on a lot of Christmas cards. But I thought it was put together really well. So let me read this for you. And this really, I think, captures well the amazing aspect of his influence. So listen to this. Here is a man who was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in another obscure village where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. And then for 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book, never held an office, never even owned a home. He never had a family, never went to college, never put a foot inside a big city. In fact, he never traveled 200 miles from the place where he was born. He never did one of the things that usually accompanies greatness. He had no credentials but himself. While still a young man, the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. One of them denied him. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a false trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. His executioners gambled for the only piece of property he had on earth while he was dying, his coat. When he was dead, he was taken down and laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 19 wide centuries have come and gone, and today he is the centerpiece of the human race. I am far within the mark when I say that all the armies that have ever marched, and all the navies that have ever been built, and all the parliaments that have ever sat in government, all the kings that have ever reigned, all of them put together have not affected the life of man upon this earth as powerfully as has that one solitary life. And that was just a little piece put together. It's called One Solitary Life by James Allen Francis. But that's pretty powerful to me. In fact, it's very compelling just to think about the influence that this one person has had. And I think it gives, in general, not by itself, but as you're building this cumulative case, I think it provides some very compelling evidence that this person might in fact be God. Well, the next one I want to look at, number 5, is that this individual, Jesus, fulfilled many prophecies about a coming Messiah that were given hundreds of years before he lived. Somebody has compiled a list of up to 70 prophecies in the Old Testament, prophecies about a coming Savior, a coming Messiah, that Jesus fulfilled. Now, if you look through this list of 70 prophecies, some are more impressive than others, I'll be honest. Some of them are more, I think a good way to understand them would be almost like foreshadowing. So, for instance, you take the story of Jonah, right? And whether you interpret that literally or not, in the story of Jonah, Jonah is swallowed by a whale for 3 days and 3 nights, right? And then Jesus is dead. He dies and is buried for 3 days and is resurrected. So even though that's not an exact prophecy, it's more like a foreshadowing. A more powerful one would be like the story of Joseph. So you might remember the story of Joseph from the book of Genesis, where he was sold into slavery by his brothers and goes through a horrendous experience, being falsely accused of a crime and is thrown in jail. But then through all these hardships, God raises Joseph up to become very influential in the world. And in that position, Joseph then literally saves the entire world. You might remember the story about how he collects food because of a coming famine, and then through his high, powerful position in Egypt, Joseph is able to rescue the world from starvation, from this famine, by the food that he's collected for 7 years. So many parallels between the story of Joseph and then what Jesus did later in being basically sold out by his own people, but then through that process saving the world, in this case from our evil choices. So all those type of prophecies are more foreshadowing prophecies, which I think are fairly impressive. But there are some of these 70 prophecies, some of them are very, very specific. And I find these specific ones very, very powerful. And I want to cover just 2 of them tonight, what I think are the 2 most compelling prophecies of Jesus in the Old Testament. Now, just a little bit of background knowledge here. We know the Old Testament was written before Jesus, just from a historical perspective. So there cannot be any accusation of, writing these things into the Old Testament. Just for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Dead Sea Scrolls was a huge discovery made, I think, in the 1940s or 50s in Israel. And these Dead Sea Scrolls were part of a religious group there in Israel. And these scrolls then are dated to 100 BC. So these scrolls that were found are dated to 100 years before Jesus was even born. And in these scrolls, this collection of scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they contain a part of all of the Old Testament books, except for Esther. So we know just from that alone that the Old Testament existed before Jesus was born. So we know these things were there, these prophecies were written down, and we have historical evidence of that before Jesus was even born. I think probably the most powerful prophecy that Jesus fulfilled is found in Daniel chapter 9. So you might want, if you have a Bible handy, you might want to take a look at some of these verses that we're going to focus on in Daniel chapter 9. Now the context here in Daniel, you might remember from Sunday school classes, right? Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were Israelites that had been captured by the Babylonians. The big bad king Nebuchadnezzar came in with the Babylonians, and it was actually part of God's judgment on the Israelites for their evil choices. But they were hauled off from Israel. Israel was destroyed, the temple was destroyed, and they were carried off to Babylon. And so the book of Daniel mostly takes place then with these Jews in exile in Babylon, Daniel being one of them. Now this prophecy in Daniel 9 then was given to Daniel when he was in exile in Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, and it was given to Daniel about 500 years before Jesus was born. In the context of this chapter, in Daniel 9, Daniel is praying to God, and he's praying to God about when God was going to restore Israel back to the Promised Land. So again, most of the Israelites had been captured and hauled off to Babylon, including Daniel, and Daniel was praying to God, asking God, when are you going to allow us to go back home, so to speak? When are you going to allow us to go back to Israel? That's what Daniel was praying about. And God, in Daniel chapter 9, answered Daniel's prayer and said, I'm paraphrasing obviously, I will restore you and your fellow Israelites back to the land, but you know what? I'm going to do something even greater than that in the future. I'm going to do something even greater than moving you back to the Promised Land. And that's the context in which God gives this prophecy then to Daniel. So let's look at the verses then and walk through them very, very carefully, because this is powerful, fulfilled prophecy. So here's the verses from Daniel 9 that we're going to focus on. Daniel 9, 24 through the first part of 26. This is God now speaking to Daniel, and he says, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city, Jerusalem, to finish the wrongdoing, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for guilt, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and understand that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, remember that had been destroyed by the Babylonians, so from the issuing of that decree until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again, talking about Jerusalem, with streets and moat, even in times of distress. Then, note this, after the 62 weeks, the 7 weeks, then the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Now let's walk through this really carefully and pick apart, because we're given an exact timeline here of when the Messiah was going to come, almost 500 years before Jesus was born. So take a look. He says here that 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city. Now in this context, he's using the word week in a way that we're not used to as English speakers. When we use the word week, we mean a week of days. So 7 days in a week as we use it. In this context, he's using week to refer to a period of 7 years. So a week of years. So in this context, a week is not 7 days, but 7 years. So you can do the math. 70 weeks, with each week being 7 years, would be a total of 490 years. So we can ask then, okay, what is going to be accomplished within these 490 years? And there's a list. Right at the beginning of these verses, he lays out, these are the things that are going to be accomplished, evidently by the Messiah. So the question that we're getting at is, okay, so when is this Messiah going to arrive? And this is what's so impressive about this prophecy, because an exact time is given to when this Messiah, this Savior, is going to arrive. As the prophecy goes, from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah, the Prince. So the clock starts, in other words, sometimes people call this the prophecy clock or the Messiah clock. The clock begins when a decree is issued to rebuild Jerusalem. Now in Daniel's time that had not happened yet. That was still going to happen in the future. And we know from history, just secular history, we know that this decree was given in 445 BC. I'll just try to recap the history really quickly. But the Babylonians were pretty much in charge of the world at the time. They were the world empire. They're the ones that conquered Israel and hauled them off to Babylon as exiles. But the Persians rose up against the Babylonians, and the Persians defeated the Babylonians, and the Persians became the new world empire. They overtook the Babylonians. And when the Persians took over, when they defeated the Babylonians, they're the ones, the Persians, that let the Jews move back to Israel. Okay? And we know from just secular history, historical sources, that the king of Persia gave this decree to rebuild Jerusalem in 445 BC. So if you're tracking with me, from 445 BC until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. In other words, let me just do the math really quickly. From 445 BC till Messiah will be 7 weeks, which is 49 years, and 62 weeks, which is 434 years. So you add those together, that's 483 years total. This puts the Messiah right at AD 38. But some people have said, well, actually, they calculated years a bit differently back then, and they calculated mistakenly, but that's just how they did it in the ancient world, or some people did in the ancient world. They calculated years more with a 360-day annual cycle instead of a 365. Then they would do things to make up after so many years. But if you calculate years that way, that puts you remarkably at AD 33. And there's debate on this. You can read different commentators and different people as they're trying to analyze this and trying to figure out calendars from the ancient world and how they calculated their years and such. But regardless, right, whether it's 38 or 33, it's clearly, and nobody can deny this, it's clearly within the 30s AD, which I find to be quite remarkable. Very, very impressive. Because what it's doing then, what it's done, this prophecy has predicted that the Messiah will arrive in the AD 30s. And even if we can't get it down to the exact year, that doesn't bother me, because in this context we're talking about weeks, right? Weeks of years. So in a sense, you can interpret the prophecy as saying after so many weeks, or in this week, this is going to happen. So you can't get it down to the day or get it down maybe even to the exact year, but within that 7-year period, which I think we can do, the Messiah is going to arrive. And that's, of course, when Jesus performed his ministry, is in the 30s, the AD 30s. I find it similar to if somebody would, let's say I would prophesy, I'm not a prophet, but let's say I would tell you, next week you're going to break your leg, right? Now, whether you broke your leg on Monday or you broke your leg on Friday, it's still next week. And I think most people would find that impressive, unless I was the one who broke your leg. But my point is, if I would prophesy that something would happen to you next week, and it would happen, right, that would be impressive, whether it was at the beginning of the week or the end of the week. Same thing here, if we can, as best we can, calculate this time when the Messiah was going to arrive to this 5 to 10 year period, and in fact, Jesus arrives and does all these miraculous things and moral teaching at that time period, well, I think you've nailed it. And that's why I find this prophecy so compelling. Now, the last thing I want to note from this prophecy is it says that there's something peculiar is going to happen in the AD 30s then. And this is the last part of the verses here. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. Now this is very peculiar because as the Jews understood the coming Messiah, they understood him as this person was going to come in and rescue them and protect them and do all these wonderful things. But here, according to the prophecy, not only when the Messiah was going to come, but also says this kind of mysterious thing that the Messiah, when he comes, is going to be cut off, whatever that means. Cut off and have nothing. So it gives the impression that the Messiah is going to fail. But I think the reader could ask at the time, Daniel and others during the Old Testament times, could ask, how could the Messiah accomplish these things he's supposed to accomplish by failing, by being cut off? How would failing accomplish these things? Well, there's another well-known prophecy in the Old Testament that explains exactly how this is going to happen, how the Messiah is going to accomplish these things by failing. And of course, what I'm referring to is the great prophecy of Isaiah 53. As I said, we're only going to cover 2 of these prophecies. Somebody has made a list of 70 of them. You can study those. It's a fascinating topic to study all of them and think through them all. But we're just looking at 2, and the other one I want to point you to is Isaiah 53. And I just want to read several of these verses from Isaiah 53. It'll take a few minutes, but I think it's worthwhile just to see how impressive it is and how it meshes up really well with what we see here in Daniel 9, that the Messiah is going to be able to accomplish these things by failing, if you will, even though they might not have understood exactly how, but Isaiah 53 tells us, in a sense, how. So Isaiah 53, it talks in the past tense, but it's actually in everybody, even when it was first written, everybody understood it was talking about a future time. And Jews, we'll talk about this after we go through it, but Jews understood that this was Messianic, that Isaiah 53 was talking about the coming Messiah that would arrive someday. So take a look at these verses from Isaiah 53. I'll read through them. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And like one from whom men hide their face, he was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening of our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. All of us like sheep have gone astray, each of us has turned to his own way, but the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he didn't open his mouth. Like a lamb that's led to slaughter, like a sheep that's silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, even some of the same phraseology from Daniel 9, he was cut off out of the land of the living for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due. His grave was assigned with wicked men, yet he was with a rich man in his death, because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. But the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. If he would render himself as a guilt offering, he will see his offspring, he will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many, as he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide the booty with the strong, because he poured out himself to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he himself bore the sin of many, and interceded for the transgressors. So this is just a spot-on prophecy of what Jesus would accomplish through his death. By dying on the cross, by being cut off, by failing, so to speak, he was able to rescue the entire world, perform that substitutionary role in his atonement, dying on the cross, that we all deserved. He took our sin, he took our iniquity, our transgressions on himself, and paid the penalty for them when he failed or was cut off, when he died on the cross. So I just find this to be very, very powerful. These two combination, if this is all we had, I would find this remarkable fulfilled prophecy. But there's a list of 70 others as well. As I mentioned before, this was seen as messianic by the Jews all the way up until the AD 1100s. So if you start doing some research about Isaiah 53, you'll see that around the AD 1100s, Jews started interpreting Isaiah 53 not to be about the Messiah, but to be about Israel. But if you evaluate that interpretation, it just doesn't fit. This doesn't seem like a description of Israel, for no other reason than that Israel wasn't sinless. Right? Israel had a lot of, it's recorded in the Old Testament, Israel as a nation did a lot of terrible things. In fact, that's why God brought in the Babylonians to punish them for their evil. But this servant, this Isaiah 53 servant, is described as being sinless and perfect and dying for the sins of others, which Israel has never done, obviously. So it seems a stretch to me, this new interpretation of it, starting in the 1100s AD, to be Israel and not the Messiah. Before that, Jews had always seen this as messianic. But because of pressure from Christians, I think that was their motivation to move away from seeing this as messianic. Okay, let's move on now to the sixth reason. The sixth reason to believe that Jesus is God, and that is his miracles. And this is something that we as a class have already covered, so we won't go through it in nearly as much detail as we have the last several weeks. But when I'm giving this lecture, or if you want to compile this material and speak on it to youth groups or whatever, this would be the place now where you could quickly summarize the evidence for Jesus' miracles. So we could talk about just a little bit of review for us, but you could talk about the purpose of miracles, right? They're similar to, in olden days, when kings would have signet rings that they would press into their letters with melted wax as evidence that the message really was from the king, because the king was the only one who had that ability to do that. And miracles perform that same function, and that they give us evidence that a message really is from God, because God's the only one who can do miracles. And then you can walk through, and for us it's just a bit of review, how then Jesus' miracles, the good historical evidence we have for Jesus' miracles, confirm his message. And his message, of course, was that God, the Supreme Being, is a Trinity, which is one being, God, but 3 divine persons, Jesus being one of those persons of the Trinity. So that was Jesus' message, and then that message that he is God was confirmed by his miracles. We can walk through, how do we know if a miracle has happened? Well, it's really the same way that we know any rare event in history happened. You got to look at the historical evidence. And the amount and quality of evidence for Jesus' miracles far exceeds that of any other miracle claim. And you can do some comparisons, right? You can take some other miracle claims from history and do a compare and contrast for the evidence for these miracles. So like take Muhammad in the Islamic religion, right? According to the Quran, which is their scripture, according to the Quran, Muhammad was asked by several people to do miracles to prove that he really had messages from God. So whoever these people were who asked him, I think were asking a legitimate question. And according to the Quran, and I have the verses written out here, you can look them up as well or contact me and I can give them to you. I'm not going to rattle them off. But according to the Quran, Muhammad refused to do miracles to back up his claim that he really had messages from God. It was 100 to even 200 years later that some people started claiming that Muhammad did miracles. These supposed miracles are found in what's called the Hadith, and it's a later collection of Muhammad's sayings and doings. But al-Bukhari, the most reliable author of the Hadith, he admits that most of these alleged miracles are not authentic, and most even Muslim scholars agree that these later miracles that were attributed to Muhammad are not historically genuine. They're not authentic. So you can do comparisons like that with the evidence for Jesus' miracles to, other supposed miracles, like maybe Joseph Smith in Mormonism. But we've worked through this material a lot already, and we walked through this outline, which I'll just refresh your memory, looking at historical evidence that Jesus even existed, good historical evidence he claimed to be God. He backed up that claim with miracles. And this is a point where you can make a case for the possibility of miracles if there is a God. Right? That's the best way to argue for the mere possibility of miracles, is to make the case that there is a God, because if God exists, then certainly he can do these miracles. At least that makes them possible. But we still need to evaluate the evidence. Most of the historical information we have about Jesus' claim and his miracles is from the New Testament. Not exclusively. As we saw, there's other historical, secular, non-Christian sources that talk about these things, but mostly we know about Jesus' claim to be God and his miracles from the New Testament. So we evaluated the New Testament to see if it was historically reliable, accurate copy of the original, good evidence that we have an accurate copy, and we looked at several reasons to believe the New Testament authors were telling the truth when they recorded these miraculous things. So we worked through that material already, but if you're presenting this as a cumulative case, these are the type of things that you want to walk through with people. So view these lectures that I'm giving in this class not only for your own benefit, but I'm encouraging you to take the things that you've learned and see how you can use them to help others. Christians who might be having doubts about their faith, Christians who maybe really enjoy this sort of thing and they want to learn them so that they can be better witnesses and better evangelists and share the gospel better. So you can present this material to those type of Christians, and of course to non-Christians. You can be of a benefit to non-Christians as you master this material and then share it with others. So feel free to use all this material I'm giving you and put it in your own words so that it's your own, you're putting it together in your own ministry, right? Your own service to others. All right, the last one, number 7 then, we're talking about reasons to believe that Jesus is God. The last one is his resurrection, that Jesus rose from the dead. And you could say, well, this is just one of his miracles, right? Maybe you could just squeeze this into number 6. But I don't do that, and I don't do it for 2 reasons. The first reason is that the resurrection, it's true, it's one of his miracles, but it's probably the most important miracle. In fact, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says that our entire Christian faith rises or falls on the resurrection. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, Paul says, our faith in him, our trust in him, is worthless. Plus, it's the key miracle that throughout the rest of the New Testament, after it happens, the rest of the New Testament always refers back to it as the key miracle which validates Jesus' message and his claim to be God, to be the Messiah. So you can look, we're not going to take the time to do it, but you can look at Acts 17, where Paul has that conversation with the Greek philosophers and shares the gospel with them and says that God has provided proof of this message to all men by raising Jesus from the grave. So the resurrection is the key miracle. The second reason that I wanted to pull it out and separate it from number 6 and focus on it specifically is that I want to give you a different approach for providing evidence for it. Now, this is going to take a little bit of explanation, but I want to give you a different approach in making a historical case for Jesus' resurrection. So think about it. I think an easy way to think about this is, you remember we walked through several arguments for the existence of God, separate ways to argue for the same thing, that there is a God that exists. Similarly, there's different ways that you can argue for Jesus' resurrection. Okay? And so I want to give you, for the rest of tonight, basically what we're going to do is focus on this alternative approach to making a case for Jesus' resurrection. Sometimes this approach is called the minimal facts approach. The minimal facts approach to Jesus' resurrection. Somebody who's really well known for this approach is Gary Habermas. Gary Habermas would be a key name if you want to write maybe about this particular issue, a good name to start with. Some background on Gary Habermas: he was skeptical of Christianity for years. He explored many other religions, almost became a Buddhist. But he became fascinated with looking into the historical evidence for Jesus. He went and got his PhD from Michigan State University because he wanted to study the critical historical method that professional historians use to try to evaluate whether something really happened in history or not. How do historians ascertain what really happened in history? So he went and studied that at Michigan State University. And now he's one of the most foremost experts on the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. I had the opportunity to take a class with him when I was in seminary working on my master's degree, and got to know him a little bit and be under his teaching and all of the historical evidence and research that he had done, and I really enjoyed it. Here's a quote from Dr. Habermas where he explains this minimal facts approach. He says, a case for the resurrection of Jesus, obviously, can be built by using only those minimal facts, that's why it's called minimal facts approach, by using only those minimal facts that are clearly established by the historical method, the method that historians use to ascertain what happened in history. These facts then can be used to refute the alternative hypotheses and provide the best evidences for Jesus' resurrection. So let me try to explain more about this approach. When somebody makes a case for the historicity of Jesus' resurrection using this minimal facts approach, they only use historical information that passes these two tests. They only use historical information that, first of all, is extremely well evidenced, and then secondly, is affirmed by virtually all scholars, even critical scholars and non-Christian scholars. So you limit yourself to only using these types of pieces of historical information. And from these pieces alone, you can build a very strong case for the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. That's why it's called a minimal facts approach. This is different than I want to do some compare and contrast here with the approach that we've taken before, so you can see the differences between these two approaches. This is different than the approach we did before, where we started by making a case for the historical reliability of the New Testament, right? That's what we did for weeks. We made an argument, looked at evidence to conclude that the New Testament as a whole is historically accurate, and then whatever the New Testament says can be historically relied upon, right? That was the approach we took. This approach is different. This approach just focuses in on these minimal facts to ascertain whether Jesus' resurrection really happened or not. Sometimes I think of the two approaches like this. I think of them as the umbrella approach, which we did already, to this minimal facts approach or sniper approach. So I think of it, in my mind, just conceptually as the umbrella approach versus the sniper approach. As I said, the umbrella approach starts by establishing that the New Testament is historically reliable. And then if you do that, right, if you establish that umbrella, then everything underneath the umbrella can be trusted. So everything in the New Testament then is historically reliable. You start with that, which we did for several weeks, making a case for the historical reliability of the New Testament. And then after you do that, everything that's in the New Testament can be relied on historically, whether it's the Sermon on the Mount or changing water to wine or Jesus walking on water, including, obviously in the New Testament, Jesus' resurrection. That's one approach. I think it's a very viable approach. We walk down that approach. But what I'm providing you here tonight is another approach to provide evidence for Jesus' resurrection. What I'm calling now the sniper approach, where you zone in specifically only on Jesus' resurrection. So let me walk you through some of the strengths of this approach. Because with the umbrella approach, you can get sidetracked fairly easily. And maybe this has happened to you in conversations before. So if you're trying to establish that the New Testament is a collection of historically reliable documents, somebody might bring up, well, who wrote Hebrews then? And then you can get sidetracked into this, well, we're not quite sure who wrote the book of Hebrews, but, or somebody might say, when was the Gospel of John written? Because, that's a big topic of controversy, and then you have to go down that rabbit trail of when John was written exactly. Somebody might bring up differences between the Gospels, and we covered that, but it took some time, right? We had to get a little bit sidetracked from Jesus' miracles and talk about the differences between the Gospels, and can we still trust them even though there's supposed contradictions, and how big really are these differences. Or you might get sidetracked with this approach with things like, does the New Testament have any historical mistakes in it? Is it mostly true, but does it have some historical mistakes? And then you can get caught up going down that rabbit trail, where with the sniper approach or the minimal facts approach, you can really just avoid all of those other issues. Because all you're asking really with this approach is, did Jesus rise from the dead or not? That's the main point. You don't think the Gospel of John is historically reliable, That's fine. I don't need it for this argument. We can just throw the Gospel of John completely out for the sake of argument, right? I think there's good historical evidence for the Gospel of John. But if you're talking with a critic, let's say, if you're talking with somebody who's skeptical, you can say, hey, for the sake of argument, for the purpose of just focusing on Jesus' resurrection, let's just take the Gospel of John out of the equation. I'll just agree with you for the sake of argument that it's not reliable. And we'll just throw it out for this particular argument. You don't think that Jesus said a lot of the things that the New Testament claims he said? That's fine. We don't need that for this argument. We're only going to use the minimal facts that are agreed upon by all scholars. And that's really the power of this method. You don't have to establish this first. You can just zoom in straight on the key miracle, which is Jesus' resurrection. Did he rise from the dead or not? This approach does use pieces of information from the New Testament, but again, only those parts or verses from the New Testament that pass those two tests, that they're very well evidenced and agreed upon by all scholars. So you're only using data that even critical non-Christian scholars agree is genuine. For example, and we've talked about this before, but for example, all scholars are very impressed by the historical evidence for 7 of Paul's 13 letters in the New Testament. Now, there's pretty good historical evidence for all the 27 books in the New Testament, but these 7 books in the New Testament just have so much historical evidence for them that nobody questions their historical reliability. Everybody agrees. Christian, non-Christian scholars agree. These 7 books, letters from Paul in the New Testament are historically reliable. And those are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. So the minimal facts approach would limit you then to just these things that are agreed upon by all scholars. Critical scholars really like Paul because he was well educated, he was in a position to know the truth and eyewitnesses. They like him because he was an enemy of Christianity at first, but then converted over to Christianity. And they like these 7 letters in particular because there's just so much historical evidence for them. I will say, before we move on with this approach, that there are some Christians who really dislike this approach. I think it's unfortunate, and I think the reasons that they dislike it is because they misunderstand it. Some Christians dislike the minimal facts approach because they think if somebody uses this approach that they are rejecting some of these other things, like the Gospel of John, or that they're admitting that there are mistakes in the New Testament, or that they're saying that there are contradictions between the Gospels. And that's not necessarily the case. I mean, some people who use the minimal facts approach would agree to those things, but the vast majority of people, including Gary Habermas, who use this minimal facts approach, aren't rejecting those other parts of the Bible. They're just saying, for the sake of this approach, for the sake of argument, if I'm having a conversation with the critic, I'll only use the pieces of information that all critics agree to. And if I limit myself to only those things, I can still make a very powerful case for Jesus' resurrection. And I think that's why Christians who dislike this are missing a tremendous opportunity to provide a powerful argument for Jesus' resurrection, because you're only using those things that even critical scholars would agree to. It's not that you're rejecting those things yourself, but you're not using this for this argument because the critical scholars have rejected them. So you're just saying, in a sense, for the sake of argument, you want to reject those things? Fine. I don't really need those things to make a powerful case for the resurrection. I think it's similar to asking the question whether or not the Titanic really sank. there's similar disagreement among scholars and eyewitnesses about some of the details, right? And so scholars and people can debate about, various details about the New Testament, just like there's debate about various details of the sinking of the Titanic. Some eyewitnesses say that the ship broke in two pieces and then both pieces sank separately. Other people say, eyewitnesses claim, no, it actually sank in one piece and then broke under the water eventually, obviously, because on the bottom it's in two pieces. So there's differences of the details, but everybody agrees that the Titanic sank, right? Even though there's differences on the details. And I think that's a similar analogy to making a case here for the resurrection. Even if there's some disagreement about some minor details of the New Testament, we're getting down to brass tacks and asking, did the main thing really happen? Let's say, for the sake of argument, yeah, there are some contradictions between the Gospels. But does that really matter if there is or there isn't? If Jesus rose from the dead, if that really happened, then, whether there's maybe some contradiction between the Gospels or not is really a minor issue. Because if Jesus really rose from the dead, then that pretty much settles Christianity. As I said, I agree with Paul that Christianity rises or falls based on Jesus' resurrection. Well, let's get down to these minimal facts then. What are these minimal facts that pass these two tests, that are very well evidenced and that all scholars affirm? We're going to look at a list of 10 of them. You can do this in a couple different ways, but I'm just going to do a list of 10 of these minimal facts. So the first one is that Jesus died by crucifixion. Extremely well evidenced and affirmed by all scholars. The second minimal fact everybody agrees to is that Jesus was buried. Initially, his disciples were in despair. Number 4, the tomb was found empty. Now, in particular, Gary Habermas has made a database of over 3,000 scholars, German, French, and English-speaking scholars over the last 50 years, New Testament scholars whose professional job is to research these things. And he's made this database of all these scholars and which things they affirm and don't affirm. He has acknowledged that only 3/4 of scholars affirm that the tomb was found empty, which is still the majority, so still impressive, but we want to just acknowledge that. Number 5, everybody agrees that the disciples had experiences which they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. So these non-Christian scholars, they don't think that they really experienced the risen Jesus, but they affirm historically that the disciples believed that. And one of the reasons that have led virtually all scholars to believe that is because they were willing to die. And people don't die for things that they know are false. So number 6, the disciples were transformed into such boldness that they were willing to die. The resurrection was preached early in Jerusalem. We talked about that before with those creeds. Number 8, the day of worship was moved to Sunday. Why is that important? Well, remember, in the Jewish tradition, worship was on the Sabbath, Saturday. And that was a tradition for centuries and very important to the Jews. And so to change the day of worship from Saturday to Sunday, and the early Christians did that because they claimed that Jesus rose from the dead on Sunday, right? That's why they changed the day of worship. That was a huge part of their belief system to change. So historians have asked, well, why make that change? What's the best explanation of why they would make such a huge change? And the resurrection of Jesus on Sunday seems to be a good, if not the best, explanation of why they did that. Number 9, historians really like Paul, as I said, because he was radically converted from an experience he believed to be an appearance of the risen Jesus, from being an enemy of Christianity to being a Christian himself. One of the reasons why historians like Paul so much from a historical perspective. And then the last one, number 10, James, the brother of Jesus, also was converted from doubting that. Remember, he was one of the ones who thought his brother Jesus was out of his mind. But something changed so that he, in James, that he accepted that his brother was the Messiah. And the good explanation of that is that he saw the resurrected. His brother rose from the dead. So after, the way that this approach works then is after you lay out these minimal facts, then you ask the question, okay, these facts are agreed upon by everybody, all the professional scholars in this field agree on these facts, so then the next step in this approach is to ask, what's the best explanation, kind of an abductive reasoning approach, what best explains all these facts? What's the best explanation of all these things that everybody agrees are true? And then you could argue, and I think it's very well done, that Jesus' literal, actual rising from the dead is the best explanation of these 10 minimal facts that are agreed upon by all scholars. So I'm going to show you a video from William Lane's Craig ministry, and where he does a similar approach to this. I'm summarizing Gary Habermas's minimal facts approach, but I'm going to show you a video now from William Lane Craig's ministry where he does a slightly different version of this same minimal facts approach.
Why was Jesus of Nazareth crucified? Because he made outrageous claims about himself. He claimed to be the one and only Son of God. Why would anyone take his claim seriously? Well, that all depends. If Jesus actually rose from the dead, then his claim to be God's unique Son carries considerable weight. On the other hand, if the resurrection never actually happened, then Jesus may be safely dismissed as just another interesting but tragic historical figure. Did Jesus rise from the dead? As we explore this question, we need to address two further questions. What are the facts that require explanation? And which explanation best accounts for these facts? There are three main facts that need to be explained. The discovery of Jesus' empty tomb, the appearances of Jesus alive after his death, and the disciples' belief that Jesus rose from the dead. Let's examine each of these. Fact number one. The discovery that Jesus' tomb was empty is reported in no less than 6 independent sources, and some of these are among the earliest materials to be found in the New Testament. This is important because when an event is recorded by 2 or more unconnected sources, historians' confidence that the event actually happened increases, and the earlier these sources are dated, the higher their confidence. Moreover, the Gospels indicate that it was women who first discovered that Jesus' body was missing. This is likely historical because in that culture, a woman's testimony was considered next to worthless. A later legend or fabrication would have had men make this discovery. Our confidence in the empty tomb is further increased by the response of the Jewish authorities. When they heard the report that the tomb was found empty, they said that Jesus' followers had stolen his body, thereby admitting that Jesus' tomb was, in fact, empty. Most scholars, by far, hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb. Fact number 2. The appearances of Jesus alive after his death. In one of the earliest letters in the New Testament, Paul provides a list of witnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances. He appeared to Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Finally, he appeared also to me. Furthermore, various resurrection appearances of Jesus are independently confirmed by the Gospel accounts. On the basis of Paul's testimony alone, virtually all historical scholars agree that various individuals and groups experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Fact number 3. The disciples' belief in the resurrection. After Jesus' crucifixion, his followers were devastated, demoralized, and hiding in fear for their lives. As Jews, they had no concept of a Messiah who would be executed by his enemies, much less come back to life. The only resurrection Jews believed in was a universal event on Judgment Day after the end of the world, not an individual event within history. Moreover, in Jewish law, Jesus' crucifixion as a criminal meant that he was literally under God's curse. Yet somehow, despite all of this, the disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. They were so completely convinced that, when threatened with death, not one of them recanted. Even the Pharisee Paul, who persecuted Christians, suddenly became a Christian himself, as did Jesus' skeptical younger brother, James. Some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was. That is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. These 3 firmly established facts cry out for an adequate explanation. How do you make sense of them? Down through history, various naturalistic explanations have been offered to explain away these facts. The conspiracy hypothesis, the apparent death hypothesis, the hallucination hypothesis, and so on. All of these have been nearly universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The simple fact is that there is just no plausible naturalistic explanation of these 3 facts. The explanation given by the original eyewitnesses is that God raised Jesus from the dead. If it's even possible that God exists, then that explanation can't be ruled out. For a God who is able to create the entire universe, the odd resurrection would be child's play. An empty tomb, Jesus' appearances alive after his death, and a group of dejected followers suddenly transformed by a radical new belief in a risen Messiah. These are independently established historical facts. How do you explain them?
I think these videos like this are so helpful. I mean, especially in this day and age, most people, let's be honest, aren't going to listen to an hour, 2 hour long, lecture on this material. But if, artists can put this material together in a very powerful way in a 5-6 minute video, then whether we like it or not, that's just what more people are into today. And so you can take a video like this that summarizes some good historical research and then put it on social media and just let the conversations begin, especially around Easter. It's a really neat, exciting time to do that. So I appreciate William Lane Craig's ministry putting out these short animated videos like this. As that video hinted at towards the end, the next step in this approach then is to evaluate other explanations. And this is how abductive reasoning works. I use this silly example all the time of hearing a knock at my door and thinking through, maybe a group of people thinking through different explanations of what caused that knock. Was it a giraffe? Was it a kangaroo? Was it an alien from another planet? Or was it Mike from across the street who said he was going to be here about this time? Well, that seems to be the most plausible explanation among all those, right? So similarly, we can look or think through other proposed explanations for these facts and see if they fit the facts as well as the theory we're proposing, which is that Jesus really rose from the dead as the best explanation of these facts. So let's do some of that, and then we'll watch the follow-up video from William Lane Craig's ministry. The first alternate theory that's been proposed is that the disciples hallucinated these experiences. So as we looked at some of these scholars who affirmed these facts, they're not Christian scholars, and they would affirm that the disciples thought that they experienced this, but what they really had were hallucinations. They were in despair. Look, they were so devastated. A lot of times, when you lose a loved one, people have hallucinations of seeing their spouse or their child or parent or hearing their voices. That's fairly common human experience. So let's propose that as an alternate explanation. Maybe the disciples, his best friends, were in such despair that they hallucinated these appearances of Jesus resurrected. Well, first of all, one of the problems with that theory is that hallucinations don't happen to groups. Hallucinations are like dreams. They happen on an individual basis. Whereas we've got good historical evidence that Jesus appeared to groups and different people at the same time. So just that alone doesn't really fit group hallucination. The idea of a group hallucination just isn't very plausible just on that alone. Now, a critic might reply with something like this. And I remember when I was taking that class on the resurrection with Gary Habermas, he threw this out. He played the critic, played the devil's advocate to help us learn. And he threw out this reply from a critic. A critic might say, well, you Christians are saying that group hallucinations don't happen. Well, resurrections don't happen either. So we're both claiming things that don't really happen. So think through, maybe for a minute, how you would respond if a critic gave you that pushback. You as Christians say group hallucinations don't happen. Well, resurrections don't happen either. And I think the best way to reply to that is, look, on your account, you trying to find a naturalistic explanation, you shouldn't be open to resurrections or group hallucinations. On naturalism, trying to find a naturalistic explanation, you should reject both of those theories. But we, as Christians, theists, if you will, we're open to supernatural explanations. So we are open to, group hallucination. Even though that's not a viable natural explanation, that's a viable supernatural explanation. Just like the resurrection of Jesus isn't a viable natural explanation, it is a viable supernatural explanation. In other words, because we think that there is a God out there, he could do a group hallucination if he wanted to. He can make that happen, obviously. So if the evidence pointed to that, we're open to a supernatural group hallucination. And we're open to, if the evidence points to it, a supernatural resurrection. Because if there is a God out there, he could do either one of those things. But you, as a naturalist, trying to come up with a natural explanation, group hallucination won't work for you. And that's the point we're trying to make with that. Plus, we can also just bring out our minimal facts and say, does group hallucination fit the facts? And it doesn't seem to. So it doesn't fit the fact that there was an empty tomb, right? If all they had were hallucinations of this risen Jesus, they could say, well, man, I don't know if that really happened or if we're just having a hallucination. Let's go check the tomb. And if Jesus' body is there, then we'd know it really was a hallucination, right? Just similar to what somebody could do today. If they started hearing voices of their loved one who passed away, they could, theoretically, might be a bit morbid, but they could go check the gravesite to see if their loved one was really there or not. So it doesn't explain the empty tomb, plus it doesn't explain Paul and James's conversions, because they weren't in despair, right? Well, maybe you could argue James was because it was his brother, but Paul was an enemy of this movement of Christianity. He wouldn't have been induced into a hallucination over despair for a loved one because he was against Christianity. And James, I think, can fit in here too, because he wasn't believing at that time that his brother was the Messiah. So that explanation just doesn't fit the facts. How about the stolen body theory? This is the oldest theory out there, right? This theory is even recorded in the New Testament, that the Jewish leaders came up with this theory, that the disciples stole Jesus' body while the guards were sleeping. It's interesting, if we make the case that the New Testament is historically accurate, which I think we can do and we have done in this class. It's interesting then we have enemy attestation that the tomb was empty. In other words, we have enemies of Christianity, these Jewish leaders, who are agreeing that the tomb was empty. And that's one of the things that have led scholars to affirm that the tomb was empty, because you have enemies of Christianity admitting that it was empty. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had to come up with some sort of a theory to explain the empty tomb if it wasn't empty. But just looking at this theory on the surface, it seems difficult for the disciples to be able to steal the body because it was guarded by soldiers, right? According to the New Testament, the chief priests paid these soldiers, paid the guards, money to say that the disciples stole Jesus' body while they were sleeping. This is pretty unlikely because, first of all, the guards would be killed if they fell asleep on the job. Plus, in this theory, supposedly the guards were sleeping, so how would they know that the disciples stole the body if they were asleep, right? So this theory just on the surface doesn't seem to hold water. Plus, it doesn't seem to fit the facts, right? It doesn't explain the appearances. If the disciples stole the body, how do you explain the fact that all scholars agree to that they had experiences which they thought were of the risen Jesus? They wouldn't have thought that if they were the ones who stole the body. And it doesn't explain how they became bold martyrs willing to die for their belief. Because as we've made the argument many times, people don't die for things that they know are false. So just a few more to cover, and we'll be done for the night. The theory that the disciples and the women who went there first went to the wrong tomb. They were so distraught, they got so mixed up because they were emotional and sad that they went on the third day to go to Jesus' tomb, but they got confused and they went to the wrong tomb. They found it empty, and then they just jumped to this mistaken conclusion that Jesus must have rose from the dead, right? Well, again, if this what happened, then why did the Jewish leaders claim that the disciples stole the body, right? If the disciples and the women just went to the wrong tomb, then the Jewish leaders could have just said, hey, guys, you went to the wrong tomb. Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Here you go. Here's the right tomb, and here he is. He's still there. But no, the Jewish leaders, the enemies of the early Christian movement, had to come up with the theory to explain the empty tomb. So this doesn't seem to fit the facts. Plus, it doesn't explain the appearances, right? So going to the wrong tomb and jumping to that conclusion might be possible, but then that theory doesn't really seem to explain these appearances later of Jesus resurrected. Another theory that's been proposed is that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, he just fainted. This is called the swoon theory, because it's the idea that he didn't die on the cross, he just swooned. And people thought that he died, but he really hadn't. A couple reasons why this theory doesn't make much sense just on the surface. It's very unlikely that somebody would survive a crucifixion experience. This is a horrible, horrendous experience by professionally trained executioners whose job it was to make sure the people were dead before they took them down off the cross. So it's very unlikely that somebody could survive this brutal experience. In fact, 3 medical doctors, I think you'll find this interesting, 3 medical doctors, one of them a pathologist from the Mayo Clinic, evaluated the historical evidence and concluded that Jesus must have died on the cross. Their results were published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and I want to read for you a small paragraph from that article that was published by these 3 doctors. They wrote, "Clearly, the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted and supports the traditional view that the spear thrust between his right rib probably perforated not only the right lung, but also the pericardium and heart, and thereby ensured death. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge." Secondly, you wouldn't think that a bloodied, half-dead Jesus would inspire the disciples to become these bold martyrs, or inspire the disciples to think that he rose from the dead. Right? If he would crawl out of the tomb, half dead and all bloody and need medical, they wouldn't think he rose from the dead. They would just conclude, wow, somehow he survived that process. They wouldn't jump to resurrection seeing a bloody, beat-up Jesus like that. Plus, it doesn't fit the facts, right? The facts that everybody agrees to, that Jesus died by crucifixion. It doesn't explain the appearance, or doesn't explain their bold transformation. Seeing a bloody, beat-up Jesus like that would not transform them into these bold martyrs. And it doesn't explain these converts, Paul and James. That wouldn't impress them to convert and come to this conclusion that no, Christianity is true. Okay, I think two more to go. Another theory is that a substitute died in Jesus' place. This is what Muhammad said, the founder of Islam. He said 600 years later, 600 years after the fact, after Jesus supposedly died on the cross, Muhammad said that no, it wasn't Jesus. They actually substituted Judas up there, and it was Judas that died on the cross. And this goes back to what I always say, it's so easy to come up with these possibilities. Are these things possible? Of course they're possible, right? Was Jesus an alien from another planet? That's possible. I'm open to that possibility. But give me some evidence for it, right? Give me more evidence than Muhammad supposedly being told by an angel in a cave 600 years later that it was Judas that died on the cross instead of Jesus. If somebody wants to give me an alternative theory, that's fine. But this is what I'm going to ask them. Do you have any eyewitness testimonies? Do you have any historical sources from the first century? Do you have multiple independent sources from the first century for your theory? Because we do. And we can come up with possibilities all day long, but you got to back it up with some historical evidence if you want us to take it seriously. Plus, it just doesn't fit the facts, right? All these theories, you can take the minimal facts. That's one of the powerful things about this approach, is you can take these minimal facts and see if these possibilities or theories measure up or can explain these facts. And of course, this one flatly contradicts the first two, that it was Jesus who died by crucifixion. And all scholars who evaluate this have come to that conclusion. Oh, let me say this. So there's actually two different theories. And it depends on who's in on it, right? Who's in on this trick? Who's in on this hoax? Was it just Jesus and his substitute, or was it all the disciples? Okay? So if the theory is that it was just Jesus and his substitute, and they're the only ones supposedly knew about this hoax, then that doesn't fit these facts. But if the theory is all the disciples knew about this substitution, then it doesn't fit almost all the facts, right? So two different theories, just depends on who's in on the hoax. Was it just Jesus and his substitute, or were all the disciples in on this substitution thing? Okay, last one. And then we'll end watching that other William Lane Craig video. And this almost isn't even a theory. I'm hesitant to even bring it up, but it's something you might encounter. It's something that I've encountered from time to time. And it's this idea that the resurrection story of Jesus was just copied by older pagan myths. And this isn't really even a theory. This is just like, this is almost desperation, to be honest. And I'll explain why. You don't really see this at a professional, scholarly level, but sometimes at a popular level, you will hear people say things like this. First of all, it's important to note that most all cultures have some sort of a myth of dying and rising again. It usually has something to do with fertility, or just the normal annual season of fall and winter. Everything dies, and then spring, summer, everything comes to life again, is resurrected. And as human beings, we witness that on an annual basis, and so the vast majority of cultures and people groups have invented stories or myths to celebrate, right, the spring and the summer and everything coming to life again. So there's reason to expect why you would see myths like this all throughout history. But none of these myths have strong parallels to the New Testament account of Jesus. But even if there was such a myth, because from time to time you'll hear somebody say, well, what about this myth? And look at all these parallels between this myth and the story of Jesus. Couldn't it be that the disciples knew about this myth and then just copied it and made up their story, copying this ancient myth of a God being resurrected? Again, it's possible, but give me some first century eyewitness accounts. Give me some written document that says from the first century that that's what the disciples did. None of the disciples say that that's what they did. I don't know of any historical sources that would even hint that that's what they did in making up this story. But even if, let's say, a critic could discover or come up with some sort of an ancient myth that has a lot of parallels with the story of Jesus. Even if that happened, that still would not prove anything. And let me give you an example. I like to use the Titanic a lot. But let me give you an example of why you can't base the historicity of an event on whether or not it's similar to a fictional story that was told beforehand. That was a long sentence. Let me say it again. You can't determine whether an event happened in history based on whether that event is similar to an older fictional story or not. That's just not how you ascertain whether an historical event happened or not. No, you look at the actual evidence for the event, not whether it's similar to other fictional stories. Let me give you a case in point, the Titanic. Morgan Robertson wrote a story about a British ocean liner that was approximately 800 feet long, weighed over 60,000 tons, and could carry about 3,000 passengers. This ship, in the story, hit an iceberg on its maiden voyage in the month of April, tearing an opening in the forward part of the ship and sank along with about 2,000 passengers. The ship's name in this story was Titan. While this is all very similar, eerily similar, to the Titanic, the story that I just explained to you about the Titan was actually a fictional story in a book called The Wreck of the Titan, published by Morgan Robertson in 1898, 14 years before the Titanic sank, and several years before construction of the Titanic had even begun. Should we conclude then the historical account of the Titanic sinking is false because it's similar to an older fictional story? Think about all those parallels. It's almost creepy. But no, historical evidence is the way you decipher true from false history, not whether it's similar to an older fictional story or not. So even if somebody came up with some ancient myth that was very similar to the story of Jesus, to me, that doesn't mean anything. Because we need to evaluate the story of Jesus on its own, not whether it's similar to some other story. Just like the Titanic, we evaluate the evidence for that. That's how we determine if the Titanic really sank or not if it's similar to some older fictional story or not. Plus, it doesn't fit the facts, right? So this theory that the disciples just made up this story, copying from some ancient pagan myth, doesn't fit the facts that all scholars agree to. The empty tomb doesn't explain the resurrection experiences the disciples had, and doesn't explain their radical transformations. So let's watch this second part video from William Lane Craig's ministry where he does something similar and walks through in this animated video some of these alternate theories and how they don't fit the facts.
It's a matter of historical record that Jesus of Nazareth died and his body was placed in a tomb. It's also been firmly established that after his death and burial, his tomb was found empty. Various individuals and groups saw appearances of Jesus alive, and his disciples somehow became absolutely convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead. These are the historical facts. How do you explain them? Down through history, various naturalistic explanations have been offered to explain away these facts. Let's examine the four most popular ones. First, the conspiracy theory. According to this view, the disciples faked the resurrection. They stole Jesus' body from the tomb and then lied about seeing Jesus alive, thereby perpetrating the greatest hoax of all time. However, this theory faces overwhelming objections. It's hopelessly anachronistic. It looks at the disciples' situation through the rear-view mirror of Christian history, instead of from the standpoint of a first-century Jew. Jews had no concept of a Messiah who would be defeated and executed by Israel's enemies, much less rise from the dead. In Jewish thinking, the resurrection of the dead was a general event that takes place only after the end of the world and has no connection at all with the Messiah. The conspiracy theory also fails to address the disciples' obvious sincerity. People don't willingly die for something they know is not true. An honest reading of the New Testament makes it clear. These people sincerely believed the message they proclaimed and were willing to die for. For these and other reasons, no scholar defends the conspiracy theory today. A second attempt to explain the facts is the apparent death theory. Jesus didn't really die. He revived in the tomb, somehow escaped, and managed to convince his disciples he was risen from the dead. This theory also faces insurmountable obstacles. First, it's medically impossible. The Roman executioners were professionals. They knew what they were doing and made sure their victims were dead before taken down. Moreover, Jesus was tortured so extensively that even if he was taken down alive, he would have died in the sealed tomb. Second, this theory is wildly implausible. Seeing a half-dead man who crawled out of the tomb, desperately in need of bandaging and medical attention, would hardly have convinced the disciples that he was gloriously risen from the dead. As a result, no New Testament historians defend this theory today. A third explanation is the displaced body theory. Perhaps Joseph of Arimathea placed Jesus' body in his tomb temporarily because it was convenient. But later, he moved the corpse to a criminal's common graveyard. So, when the disciples visited the first tomb and found it empty, they concluded that Jesus must have risen from the dead. Once again, this theory cannot make sense of the facts. Jewish laws prohibited moving a corpse after it was interred, except to the family tomb. What's more, the criminal's graveyard was located close to the place of execution, so that burial there would not have been a problem. Also, once the disciples began to proclaim Jesus' resurrection, Joseph would have corrected their mistake. So, once again, no current scholars endorse this theory. Finally, the hallucination theory. The disciples didn't really see Jesus, but just imagined that he appeared before them. They were all hallucinating. This theory also faces considerable problems. First, Jesus appeared not just one time, but many times. Not just in one place, but in different places. Not just to one person, but to different persons. Not just to individuals, but to groups of people. And not just to believers, but to unbelievers as well. There is nothing in the psychological casebooks on hallucinations comparable to these resurrection appearances. Second, hallucinations of Jesus would have led the disciples to believe at most that Jesus had been transported to heaven, not risen from the dead, in contradiction to their Jewish beliefs. Moreover, in the ancient world, visions of the deceased were not evidence that the person was alive, but evidence that he was dead and had moved on to the afterworld. Finally, this theory doesn't even attempt to explain the empty tomb. Thus, the four most popular naturalistic theories fail to explain the historical facts. Where does that leave us? Another possibility is the explanation given by the original eyewitnesses that God raised Jesus from the dead. Unlike the other theories, this makes perfect sense of the empty tomb, the appearances of Jesus alive, and the disciples' willingness to die for their belief. But is this explanation plausible? After all, it requires a miracle, a supernatural act of God. Think about it. If it's even possible that God exists, then miracles are possible. And this explanation cannot be rebuffed. And surely it's possible that God exists. So how do you explain the resurrection?
Okay, well, these are the 7 reasons we went through then tonight to conclude that Jesus, in fact, is God. And this is what I do as a cumulative case argument, building the case that Jesus is, in fact, God. So, the last thing we'll do is, like always, take a look at the class schedule. This is only going to apply for those taking it here with me through Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary's Spurgeon College. So tonight is April 8th. You You had 2 chapters you needed to read for tonight, and then the corresponding reading summaries. Chapter 11 in Frank Turek's book, and then chapter 6 in J.P. Moreland's book. Next week on April 15th, 3 chapters, 12 and 13 in Turek's book, and chapter 9 in J.P. Moreland's book. And then give me those reading summaries for those by midnight on April 15th. So looking ahead, the next few weeks are pretty normal. Just some chapters, less and less chapters you'll have to read. But I would encourage you to get to work on your research paper. That's going to be due on May 6th. So look at your syllabus for the details about how long your research paper needs to be. If you have questions about it, let me know, of course. And then the final is coming up at the end of the semester, of course. And I will hand out the final on May 6th. It'll be similar to the midterm. We'll have a week, open note, open book. You'll have a week to write all the essays on the final exam, and then you'll have to email them back to me by midnight on May 13th. So May 6th is the last class, the last lecture, but then May 13th, there won't be any class that day, but you'll have to give me the final things that are due on May 13th. I have graded all your midterms now and emailed those back to you just this afternoon. So check your email for your grades. Everybody did fairly well on the midterm. And another thing that I did too, I thought would be helpful for you, is I tried to take some of the best answers for each question and then put that together. And so I included that in your email so you can look through that and see. I think that'd be a good way for all of you to learn and see some of the best answers that were given in the class, so you can see what a good answer looks like. And then that might help you prepare and just know the type of answers that I'm looking for when you take the final. So as always, if you have any questions about the exam or the paper or the class material, let me know.